Alright, let's talk about something that's been keeping Warhammer fans awake at night and sparking debate across the galaxy. Cloning the Primarchs. We're not talking about some basic gene seed replication or upgraded space marines here. No, we're diving headfirst into the idea of recreating the Emperor's lost sons. Those demigod warlords who shaped the Imperium with fire and fury. It's one of those questions that haunts the edges of lore and theory alike. Could it happen? Has it already happened without us knowing? And what would it even mean for a galaxy already teetering on the edge of annihilation? If the Imperium truly tried to bring back the Primarchs through cloning, it wouldn't just shake things up. It could completely rewrite the future of mankind. There's a reason this question, whether the Primarchs could be cloned, keeps coming up in hushed conversations between fans, buried threads on lore forums, and whispered suspicions within the lore itself. The Primarchs weren't just leaders or figureheads. They were titans, living weapons designed by the Emperor to lead humanity to victory across the stars. And now, with the galaxy crumbling, chaos gnawing at every corner, and hope wearing thinner with each passing millennium, the idea of bringing them back feels tempting, almost necessary. In a way, it's about nostalgia, both in-universe and outside of it. For the Imperium, the Great Crusade was the golden age. Humanity was rising, worlds were falling into line, and the Emperor's vision seemed almost within reach. And the Primarchs, these godlike beings, were at the center of it all. Their absence today is like a wound that never fully healed. Guilliman might be back, but he's just one. And even he isn't the same as before. Fans feel this too. There's this deep-rooted craving in the community to see the legends restored, to watch the old gods return and make sense of a universe that's fallen into madness. And let's be honest, there's something inherently epic about imagining what would happen if they did come back. Could a clone of Sanguinius stand against the tide of chaos? Would a reborn Ferrus Manus forgive the Imperium for its failures? Or would it all fall apart even faster, torn by rivalries and flawed recreations? These aren't just what-if scenarios. They're emotional pressure points for a universe defined by tragedy and loss. And in that loss, the temptation to rewind the clock, to try again, becomes almost irresistible. From the perspective of the Imperium, cloning a Primarch wouldn't just be a scientific curiosity. It would be a potential turning point. Think about it. The Imperium is fractured, battered, and held together by bureaucratic inertia and religious zeal. The return of even one more Primarch could rally systems, inspire legions, and provide something more powerful than any weapon: belief. A clone wouldn't need to be perfect. It would just need to look like the real thing, talk like him, lead like him. In the grim darkness of the far future, that illusion might be more than enough. And then there's desperation. That's something I don't think people talk about enough. The Imperium doesn't innovate because it wants to. It innovates because it has no choice. And cloning a Primarch? That's the kind of line you cross when you're standing at the edge, staring into the abyss. When you're willing to risk everything to maybe, bring back a symbol that could hold the galaxy together just a little longer. Fans often compare it to nuclear options in our own world. Dangerous, potentially catastrophic, but also the kind of tool you keep locked away until your back's against the wall. There are even theories that the High Lords of Terra, or more realistically, someone like Belisarius Cawl, might already have tried, or at least considered it. Not out of ambition, but out of sheer necessity. And honestly, that possibility feels very Warhammer. A half-mad Magos, hiding in some stasis chamber, trying to stitch together the DNA of demigods like it's just another experiment. The thought is both chilling and kind of thrilling. Of course, from a lore standpoint, the temptation is baked into the very fabric of the setting. The Emperor designed the Primarchs using arcane science and genecraft, so advanced that even the Mechanicus can't fully comprehend it today. But they do have fragments, samples, weapons, maybe even entire databanks of information. It wouldn't be the first time someone tried to reverse engineer the Emperor's work. The idea of recreating the Primarchs has always lingered like a forbidden fruit. Something just out of reach, but never entirely impossible. Some fans speculate that cloning might be how the missing legions 2 and 11 come back into the picture. Not as memories or forgotten history, but as new figures. grown in secret and released when the time is right. Others believe that chaos might beat the Imperium to it. After all, if Fabius Bile could clone a Primarch, and we'll get to that later, what's to stop someone else? In a universe where death is fluid and reality is constantly warped, the dead don't stay dead for long. They come back as monsters, saints, or something in between. There's also a strange kind of justice fans are drawn to. The idea that the Imperium, after failing its greatest heroes, might try to redeem itself by bringing them back. A cloned Vulcan walking among mortals again. A recreated Lorgar, this time raised without Chaos's whisper. Could that fix anything? Probably not. But it's the kind of hope that keeps the Grimdark from collapsing entirely into nihilism. And in a universe this brutal, even a sliver of hope can feel revolutionary. Ultimately, this question won't go away because it taps into something deeper than just biology or science fiction. It's about legacy, about the weight of myth, and about the eternal struggle between preserving the past and daring to rewrite it. Whether you're a fan dissecting codex footnotes or a tech priest dreaming of unlocking ancient knowledge, the thought of cloning the Primarchs offers a tantalizing glimpse of what could be, if only someone were brave, reckless, or desperate enough to try. When we start talking about cloning in Warhammer 40k, we quickly find ourselves in that weird space between the known and the forgotten. The universe of 40k is so saturated with decayed knowledge, religious dogma, and forbidden science that it's almost a miracle anything still functions, let alone something as advanced and controversial as cloning. But the thing is, cloning absolutely does exist in this setting. It's real, it's dangerous, and in some circles it's actively used, just not always in the ways you'd expect. The first thing to understand is that cloning isn't some fringe or mythical concept in the Imperium. It's part of the Dark Age of technology legacy, one of those ancient tools that humanity once mastered and then almost entirely lost, like artificial intelligence or faster-than-light communication without psychers. Back then, cloning wasn't just possible, it was routine. Entire armies could be grown, perfected bodies created for every imaginable purpose. That kind of mastery has long since slipped away, buried beneath layers of superstition and techno-heresy, but hints of it still pop up in the lore like rotten bones breaking through the dirt. One of the clearest examples of functioning cloning tech is, weirdly enough, Fabius Bile. I know. He's a traitor, a freak, and basically the mad scientist of the galaxy, but that's exactly what makes him important here. He proves that cloning still works. The guy literally grew a clone of Horus, which is already insane, but more than that, he's managed to replicate gene seed, create his twisted new men, and do things the Mechanicus would label heretical 1,000 times over. Fans often point to him as proof that the technology not only exists, but that it's still usable by those bold or deranged enough to wield it. Then there's the whole subject of the Adeptus Mechanicus. These guys are hoarders of ancient tech, but they're also terrified of it. They revere the STCs, standard template constructs, as holy relics, and they'll wage entire wars just to get their hands on one. Some believe that there are STCs out there specifically designed for cloning, or at least for bioreplication at a scale we can't even imagine. It wouldn't be impossible for a Forge world, especially one less tightly bound by Martian orthodoxy, to be secretly experimenting with cloning. The Adeptus Mechanicus has always had those hidden sects, those weird offshoots that dig a little too deep. If any of them found a working bio-STC, you can bet they'd be tempted to see how far it could go, even to the level of recreating something as complex as a Primarch. But let's not pretend cloning is clean or easy in this setting. In fact, it's often portrayed as deeply unstable and full of ethical horror. You don't just grow a perfect copy and plug it into power armor. Clones can be flawed, deranged, or outright dangerous. The Horus clone I mentioned? It wasn't just a carbon copy of the War Master, it was a mindless berserker, barely a shadow of the original. And that's always the risk. Even if you can recreate the body, the mind and soul, that's a whole different battlefield. Some fans argue that cloning is a poor substitute for true rebirth. The soul of a Primarch is something unique, maybe even divine, and cloning doesn't account for that. There are theories floating around that even if you could perfectly replicate a Primarch's body and brain patterns, you'd still just be building an echo, a hollow shell. especially with how heavily the warp is tied into their identities. I mean, look at Magnus or Mortarion. These aren't just super soldiers, they're deeply spiritual, warp-connected entities. Could you really bottle that in a vat? And yet, the idea persists, because there are hints that cloning tech might still be hidden within the Imperium. There's this long-running theory that the cursed founding, which produced so many flawed Space Marine chapters, might have been a covert attempt at using more extreme genetic manipulation, possibly even full cloning. Some even think the cursed founding was the Mechanicus trying to replicate Primarch DNA and failing in horrific ways. The Black Dragons, with their bone growth mutations, or the Flame Falcons, who literally ignite into fire during combat, these aren't normal gene seed flaws. They feel like experiments gone wrong. And if they were experiments, that tells us someone out there was trying to push the limits. Then there's Belisarius Cawl. This guy is the wild card of the current lore. He's not just a tech priest, he's something more. A being who's lived for 10,000 years, worked directly with Guilliman, and has openly defied the Mechanicus in ways no one else dared. Cawl has already proven he can do things the rest of the galaxy considers impossible. He created the Primaris Marines, which some fans think might be proto-clones in their own right. It wouldn't be that big a leap to imagine Cawl working on a clone of a Primarch in some sealed vault, somewhere deep in the Noctis Labyrinth, or buried beneath Mars. I think what makes cloning such an enduring topic in Warhammer isn't just the tech. It's the what-if. The sense that even in a universe ruled by superstition and decay, the ember of scientific ambition still flickers. That somewhere out there, someone might still remember how to build gods from flesh. It's a terrifying and thrilling idea all at once. Not just because of what it means for the galaxy, but because of what it says about humanity. Our refusal to let go of the past, our obsession with perfection, and our willingness to gamble with the most sacred aspects of existence. So yeah, the technology's there, barely, dangerously, and in the hands of the few who dare to use it. But whether that tech is enough to truly recreate a Primarch, that's the real question. And the deeper you go into that idea, the more you realize, maybe it's not just about can we, but should we? If there's one name that always comes up when people talk about cloning Primarchs, it's Fulgrim. Not just because he was one of the most flamboyant and terrifying of the Emperor's sons, but because his story is tangled up in one of the most insane examples of cloning gone wrong. Or maybe right, depending on how twisted your perspective is. Fulgrim is that perfect storm of beauty, horror, and ambition. And when Fabius Bile decided to try his hand at cloning a Primarch, of course it had to be Fulgrim he chose. Who else would match the sheer theatricality and danger of such an experiment? So here's the deal. After Fulgrim fell to Slaanesh and became a demon prince, he basically ascended beyond flesh. He wasn't just corrupted, he transcended. His form became fluid, serpentine, inhuman. But Bile, ever the narcissistic genius, wasn't satisfied with watching the Primarchs vanish into legend or the warp. He wanted to bring them back, to remake them. He believed he could improve on the Emperor's designs, correct their flaws, maybe even elevate them further. And Fulgrim, being both a genetic masterpiece and the poster child for perfection turned obsession, was the ideal test subject. What's wild is that Bile actually succeeded. He grew a clone of Fulgrim in a lab, and this clone wasn't just a broken, malformed copy. No, it was perfect, or at least it appeared to be. A replica of Fulgrim in his prime, before the fall, before the corruption. Elegant, brilliant, powerful. For a brief, surreal moment, it seemed like Bile had pulled off the impossible. Brought a Primarch back from the abyss in the flesh, without warp corruption, without chaos. Some fans even speculate this version of Fulgrim was a sincere attempt at redemption, like Bile was trying to reset the clock, give Fulgrim a second chance, maybe even prove that the Emperor's design could be surpassed. But the dream didn't last. The clone realized what it was, who it was based on, and what it had become. And in that realization, it broke. Maybe it was the psychological weight of knowing its original had turned into a demon. Maybe it was the sheer impossibility of escaping Fulgrim's legacy. Or maybe it was the way Bile treated it, not as a person but as a project, a piece of art, a petri dish filled with ambition. Whatever the cause, the clone turned on Bile, trying to kill him, and ultimately had to be destroyed. Not in a blaze of glory, not in a grand battle, but as a failed experiment. A beautiful failure. This story fascinates fans for so many reasons. First, it proves cloning a Primarch isn't some distant theory. It's happened. Someone actually did it. But more than that, it shows how dangerous and unstable the result can be. The body might be perfect, but the soul? That's a whole other story. A lot of us wonder whether a clone can ever escape the shadow of the original. Can you really separate Fulgrim from the pride, the fall, the madness? Or is the clone doomed to walk the same path no matter how fresh its start? There's also the ethical horror behind it all. What does it say about Bile, or anyone else, who thinks they have the right to recreate beings like this? Fulgrim wasn't just a tactical commander or a genetic marvel. He was a person, with memories, choices, and a complex, twisted journey. Cloning him strips away all that context, all that pain and triumph, and tries to reduce him to just DNA. It's a dehumanizing process, even if the subject was once nearly divine. And the fact that the clone knew this, that he felt the weight of that artificiality, that's haunting. Some fans think Bile was never actually trying to bring Fulgrim back, that the clone was always meant to be a stepping stone, proof of concept for a new breed of demigods. In that sense, Fulgrim's clone wasn't a resurrection. It was a prototype, a way for Bile to test the waters before moving on to something even more radical. And given his obsession with crafting the new men, a post-human evolution beyond even the Astartes, it's not hard to see the clone as just another failed rung on that evolutionary ladder. But there's also a romantic reading of it, bizarre as that sounds. Some fans believe Bile had genuine admiration for Fulgrim. That, in his own warped way, he wanted to save him. Bring him back before he was lost to chaos, maybe even offer him a second life, free of the mistakes of the past. And that's part of what makes this story so compelling. We don't know Bile's true motives. Was he a madman playing God, or a tragic genius trying to fix something that was never his to fix? What's undeniable is that this cloning event casts a long shadow over the entire conversation around replicating Primarchs. It proves the technology is viable, if unstable. It proves that someone with the knowledge, the resources, and the sheer arrogance can bring back these godlike figures. But it also warns us about what happens when you try to recreate perfection. You don't just get a body, you get a legacy. And that legacy is messy, painful, and almost always tainted. Fulgrim's clone is a cautionary tale. Not just for the Imperium, but for us fans who love to theorize. It's a story that asks, what are we really trying to bring back when we talk about cloning the Primarchs? Is it the hero, the myth, the symbol? Or are we just chasing ghosts, trying to resurrect something that can't be recreated without dragging all its demons along with it? Whatever the case, Fulgrim's clone reminds us that in 40K, nothing is ever simple, especially not resurrection, especially not redemption. If Fulgrim's clone showed us what happens when ambition meets tragedy, then the legends surrounding Alfarius, and maybe even Omegon, open the door to something far murkier. Alfarius has always been an enigma, the Primarch who made secrecy his identity, and that's exactly why so many fans believe cloning could be more than just a theory in his case. With him, it's not even clear who he really was, and that opens the floodgates for speculation. What if Alfarius wasn't just one man? What if he was already cloned? Or better yet, what if every Alfarius we've ever seen was part of a massive, decades-long experiment in mass-producing Primarchs? It sounds insane on the surface, right? But if you dig into the lore, it gets disturbingly plausible. Alfarius was known for blending in with his men, for creating a legion that thrived on deception and misdirection. Unlike other Primarchs, he didn't stand above his sons, he was among them. Some fans argue this was only possible because there were multiple Alfariuses. Maybe clones, maybe decoys, maybe even early attempts at duplicating a Primarch's essence to turn him into a concept, not a single identity. When you read some of the Horus Heresy books, you start to get the sense that no one, not even his brothers, were sure who Alfarius really was. And that's where the theory begins to snowball. There's this one fan theory that I absolutely love, even if it's probably nonsense. The idea that the entire Alpha Legion is made up of cloned variations of Alfarius and Omegon. That the Legion isn't just using Primarch tactics, they are the Primarchs, multiplied. It sounds like tinfoil hat territory, I know, But in the grimdark, the absurd often isn't far from the truth. There are mentions of operatives who fight exactly like Alfarius, think like him, even look like him. Are they just loyal warriors, or something more? Some go even deeper and say that Alfarius and Amagon were never individual beings in the traditional sense, that they were engineered as dual entities with the ability to replicate themselves. That the Emperor, in one last experiment before the scattering of the Primarchs, tried to make not just leaders, but a self-replicating force of command, a distributed intelligence cloaked in flesh. Of course, this kind of speculation isn't backed by any confirmed canon, but that's kind of the beauty of the Alpha Legion. Everything is lies, everything is possible, and you can never be sure where the truth ends and the story begins. Outside of the Alpha Legion, Chaos has its own weird relationship with the idea of cloning or recreating Primarchs. We already talked about Fulgrim, but he's not the only one. Fabius Bile has made multiple attempts at replicating the work of the Emperor. Not just with Fulgrim, but with other fallen sons as well. There's talk of him trying to grow versions of Horus again, despite the disastrous first attempt. And that's where things get properly chilling. Because Bile isn't just cloning for the sake of science. He's cloning as a weapon, as a kind of mockery, like he's trying to prove that the Emperor's divine creation isn't so divine after all. One of the more obscure but fascinating examples is the theory surrounding a group of warriors known only as the Sons of the Hydra. In some accounts, they seem to possess abilities and features that echo those of multiple Primarchs, not just one. These aren't just traitor Marines or gene seed experiments. Some fans believe they're Bile's attempt to create hybrid clones, blending different Primarch genomes into singular, terrifying war beasts. Imagine something with the tactical mind of Alfarius, the speed of Corvus Corax, and the brute strength of Angron. Not a clone, exactly, but an amalgamation. A genetic remix of the Emperor's worst nightmares. Of course, this raises even more questions about what cloning a Primarch really means. Is it about replicating the original exactly, or about taking their essence and twisting it into something new? Chaos doesn't care about purity. It thrives on distortion. So if anyone was going to take the idea of a cloned Primarch and turn it into a weaponized abomination, it would be the traitor legions. Some fans even suggest that the demon Primarchs themselves might attempt to possess cloned versions of their old bodies, using them as avatars to walk the physical realm without the weaknesses of their warp-bound forms. There's another theory that's popped up now and again, and while it's definitely fringe, it's one of those things that gets under your skin once you think about it. What if the Black Legion's revival wasn't just about unifying the traitors, but about laying the groundwork to bring Horus back properly? Not as a demonic echo, but as a fully cloned, restored War Master? Abaddon's obsession with legacy, his refusal to take the name Horus Reborn, might be less about humility and more about preparation. About waiting for the right moment or the right body to bring his father back in flesh and fury. And this is where the lines between science and chaos blur completely. Because if you clone a Primarch and let the warp in, what you get might not be a person at all. It might be a vessel, a living puppet for a god or daemon to wear. The clone wouldn't need to be Horus. It would just need to be close enough for something in the warp to recognize and invade. And in that context, cloning a Primarch isn't just a moral risk, it's a metaphysical disaster waiting to happen. So when we talk about clones of Alfarius or other Chaos-affiliated Primarchs, it's not just lore candy. It's a genuine reflection of how unstable and dangerous this idea really is. The Imperium might see cloning as a desperate hope, but Chaos sees it as an opportunity, a tool, a weapon, and maybe even a doorway for something much worse to slip through. In the end, all of these theories, legends, and half-truths point to the same core idea. The Primarchs left such an enormous imprint on the galaxy that everyone wants a piece of them. Whether it's the Alpha Legion hiding their true numbers behind masks of identity, or Fabius Bile pushing the boundaries of genetic horror, or Abaddon dreaming of a War Master reborn, there's this shared obsession with bringing back what was lost. But as we keep learning, again and again, the past doesn't come back clean. It comes back twisted. And sometimes what rises from the cloning vat isn't a savior, but a shadow. The moment the Primaris Marines were revealed, it felt like a tectonic shift in the setting. Suddenly we had these taller, stronger, more refined Space Marines, armed with superior gear and, most importantly, gene seed that was somehow more pure. The lore said they were crafted by Belisarius Cawl over 10,000 years, under secret orders from Roboute Guilliman himself. But if you've been around this universe long enough, you learn not to take anything at face value. And it didn't take long before whispers started creeping in. What if the Primaris weren't just upgraded Astartes? What if they were part of something bigger? A backdoor cloning project. Maybe not of the Emperor himself, but of the Primarchs. It's not just wild speculation. There are threads, little clues sprinkled throughout the lore that suggest Cawl might have gone far beyond his assigned task. Officially, he was told to refine the gene seed, fix its instability, and make better Space Marines. But Cawl isn't exactly known for his restraint. The man's lived for millennia, refuses to adhere to Martian dogma, and has access to vaults of forbidden tech that most tech priests would consider myth. If anyone was going to sneak some Primarch DNA into a top-secret science project, it would be him. Let's start with the physical differences. Primaris Marines aren't just a little stronger, they're vastly more durable, faster, and more adaptable than standard Astartes. That might not raise eyebrows on its own, but then you look at how they fight, how they think. Some fan accounts describe them as showing signs of tactical brilliance that far exceed what we'd expect from baseline gene seed enhancements. Not all of them, of course, but certain Primaris captains, like those from the Unnumbered Suns, seem to carry themselves with an eerie sense of purpose, almost like they were made for something more than just war. And then there's the eerie silence around where exactly the improved gene seed came from. Cawl supposedly used the original gene stock of the 20 Primarchs, or at least the samples that were still viable. But what does that mean, exactly? Which Primarchs? How pure were those samples? Could he have spliced in more than just minor tweaks? We're never told the full extent of his experiments, and honestly, that absence of detail is suspicious in itself. The more you think about it, the more it feels intentional, like a giant blank space where something vital should be. One popular theory is that the Unnumbered Suns, those strange transitional companies that existed before the Primaris were fully assigned to chapters, were actually test beds, not just for training, but for observation. Think about it. You've got hundreds of brand new warriors, many of whom exhibit exceptional traits, courage, leadership, strategic acumen. What if some of them weren't just superior Astartes? What if they were the result of gene line combinations pulled directly from the Primarchs themselves? Hybrids, echoes, not clones in the traditional sense, but genetic successors. It would explain a lot, like how some Primaris seem to resonate differently with the warp, or why certain lineages within them feel exaggerated, almost too defined. There are rumors among some players and lorehounds that specific Primaris display uncanny similarities to their supposed progenitors, not just in behavior, but even in facial features and combat preferences. A lieutenant with the stoic rage of Perturabo, a chaplain whose charisma borders on Lorgar's unsettling zeal, a commander with the brutal efficiency of Kurz, but none of the madness. These aren't just personality traits, they feel like fingerprints of something older. And then there's the dark theory, the one that says Guilliman didn't just authorize this project, he demanded it. Think about the state of the Imperium when he returned. The galaxy was split in two, Chaos Ascendant and his brothers either dead, lost, or corrupted. What if, in his desperation, Guilliman looked at the remains of the Primarch project and thought, we have to start again. Not recreate the past, but build a new generation. Not from scratch, but from what was left behind. The Primaris wouldn't be just warriors, they'd be seeds, vessels, replacements. Some fans even speculate that Cawl is holding back an entire generation of true Primarch clones. That the Primaris were just step one, a gradual reintroduction of high-tier genetic material used to prepare the Imperium for a time when actual clones might walk among them. It would be the ultimate contingency plan. Imagine a new Horus, one engineered to resist corruption. A new Ferrus Manius, free of weakness. A new Sanguinius, created not as a savior, but as a weapon. If you believe that, then the Primaris project isn't just about evolution. It's about resurrection. There's no official proof, of course, Games Workshop keeps these mysteries open-ended on purpose, and for good reason. It keeps us hooked. But the ambiguity fuels this obsession. The more you look at the Primaris, the more you wonder if they're telling a bigger story. One where humanity, pushed to the brink, is quietly preparing to bring back its greatest champions, not through faith or prophecy, but through science, through flesh and gene and forgotten blueprints. What makes this theory so compelling isn't just the lore, it's the implications. If the Imperium is trying to clone the Primarchs through the Primaris project, that means we're already living in the age of the Second Coming. It means the past isn't just influencing the present, it's being rebuilt inside it. The lines between old and new, between man and God, start to blur. And that's such a Warhammer thing, isn't it? Trying to reclaim lost glory by building something that might just turn on you. Playing with the bones of titans and hoping they don't remember who they were. Whether you believe the Primaris are Primarch clones or not, the idea has a gravity to it. A narrative pull that feels both hopeful and deeply ominous. Because if it is true, then the galaxy's next age won't be shaped by saints or saviors. It'll be shaped by ghosts reborn in gene forges. Stripped of memory, maybe, but not of legacy. And that legacy, it never forgets. Here's the thing. Even if the Imperium could clone the Primarchs, even if the science was sound, the DNA intact, and someone like Call had all the pieces lined up, there's still a massive, towering wall standing in the way. And that wall isn't built out of metal or reason. It's made of dogma, fear, and centuries of rigid belief. Because in the Imperium of man, the real enemy of progress isn't a lack of technology. It's a culture that sees anything new, anything different, as blasphemy. Especially when it comes to the Emperor and his divine sons. At the heart of it all is the cult Mechanicus and the ecclesiarchy. These institutions don't just serve the Imperium, they define its identity. And both are fiercely protective of the myths that keep the galaxy turning. The Emperor isn't just a man in a golden coffin, he's a god. The Primarchs aren't just military leaders, they're sacred relics of a golden age, untouchable and perfect. To suggest that they could be cloned, copied in a lab by mortal hands, isn't just unthinkable. It's heresy of the highest order. It's like trying to 3D print a saint. You don't just risk public outrage, you risk entire sectors burning in holy fire. From a religious standpoint, cloning a Primarch would break the fundamental illusion that the Imperium survives on, that the past was sacred and the present must preserve it at all costs. The ecclesiarchy has spent 10,000 years building a mythos where the Emperor's will is infallible, his work irreplaceable, and his creations divine. Introducing the idea that a tech priest could recreate a Primarch with gene code and syringes would be setting fire to every cathedral from Terra to the Halo stars. It would shatter the emotional foundation of millions, if not billions, of Imperial citizens and warriors. And then there's the political mess. Let's say, for argument's sake, that someone manages to clone, Dorn or the Lion, some loyalist hero, fully intact. Who gets to control him? The High Lords of Terra? The Mechanicus? Guilliman? Suddenly, you've got power struggles erupting across every level of the Imperium. Rival factions trying to claim ownership, leverage the clone for their own agendas, or, worse, neutralize him before he becomes a threat. Because let's face it, a cloned Primarch doesn't just inherit a face and a name. He inherits a legacy, a command presence, a cult of personality. People will follow him, even against orders. And in a galaxy constantly teetering on civil war, that kind of figure is just too volatile to risk. That's why some fans say the Imperium chooses not to clone the Primarchs, not because it can't, but because it knows exactly what would happen if it did. Bringing back a Primarch without their brothers, without the Emperor, without the context of the Great Crusade, it's like summoning a god into a world that's forgotten how to understand gods. And that god might not like what he sees. He might question why the Imperium is so broken, why it worships a corpse, why the people live in fear and ignorance. And that kind of questioning, that's the beginning of schism, of rebellion, of another heresy. There's also the uncomfortable truth that some within the Imperium don't want the Primarchs to return, cloned or otherwise. The High Lords of Terra, for instance, have built their power on the absence of strong central leadership. Guilliman's return alone was enough to shake their authority to its core. If more Primarchs were to suddenly reappear, especially under mysterious or unnatural circumstances, the political landscape would implode. Nobody wants to be the bureaucrat who tries to give orders to a demigod, and no demigod likes being told to wait for a Senate vote. The same goes for the Inquisition. These guys are obsessed with threats from within, and they'd see a cloned Primarch as the ultimate internal risk. Too powerful to control, too unpredictable to trust, and far too dangerous to be allowed freedom. You can bet your last thrones that any attempt to recreate a Primarch would trigger kill orders, purges, and likely exterminatus-level protocols if things went wrong. Because the Inquisition doesn't take chances, not with Xenos, not with Psychers, and definitely not with half-mythical figures that could destabilize entire systems by existing. There's also a philosophical barrier, something that doesn't get talked about as much, but really hits hard when you think about it. Cloning a Primarch means reducing them, turning them into a product of science instead of a figure of myth. And in a setting where narrative is everything, where the past shapes not just politics but reality itself, that kind of reduction is spiritually dangerous. It says the Primarchs weren't divine, that they were just men, replicable, replaceable. That kind of truth doesn't liberate the Imperium, it corrodes it from within. That's why, even if the technology is there, the cultural machine of the Imperium is built to reject it, to erase it, to bury it so deep in red tape and ritual that it might as well not exist. And in that sense, the true enemy of cloning Primarchs isn't just ignorance or fear, it's belief. A belief so powerful it holds back science, progress, and even salvation. Because in Warhammer 40k, belief doesn't just guide people, it shapes the galaxy. And in a galaxy shaped by blind devotion, some truths are too dangerous to even speak aloud. Still, the idea lingers, like a sin waiting to be committed. You can't unthink it. You can't unsee the potential. And the fact that it might be possible, even if no one dares to try, just makes the temptation stronger. The Primarchs were always more than warriors. They were symbols, icons, and that's what makes cloning them not just a scientific act, but a heresy wrapped in hope. A rebellion against a future that seems to offer nothing but more darkness. And that's the paradox. The Imperium in all its brutality needs a miracle. But it's terrified of the kind of miracle cloning represents, because miracles change things, and the Imperium, above all else, fears change. So let's say it happens. Let's say someone, whether it's Call in his vaults, or the Mechanicus digging through lost data, or even some rogue Inquisitor with more ambition than sense, actually manages to clone a Primarch, a real one. Not a sketchy, mutated copy or a corrupted experiment, but a fully formed, physically perfect recreation of, say, Jagatai Khan or Rogel Dorn. What happens next? Well, nothing short of a galactic earthquake. First, the question that would immediately ignite 1,000 arguments, both in the lore and among the fans. Would that clone really be the Primarch? Is he still Dorn if he doesn't remember the Siege of Terra? Is he still Vulcan if he hasn't endured the drop site massacre or wrestled with his own immortality? And honestly, this question hits at the core of identity in 40k. Because the Primarchs weren't just genetically engineered warlords, they were shaped by experience, by pain, by failure. A clone might carry the same DNA, the same muscles, maybe even the same talents. But without their memories, without their souls, are they anything more than a facsimile? And that's the terrifying part. Because if they do remember, if somehow they're reborn with the knowledge of their past lives, whether by psychic imprint or something darker, then we're talking about resurrection, a return of myth into flesh. The kind of thing that could shatter the already fragile grip the High Lords have on the Imperium. Suddenly, all the sermons, all the dogma, all the rigid power structures built over 10,000 years start to feel flimsy compared to a figure who actually walked with the Emperor. Some fans speculate that the return of even a single Primarch clone would cause mass religious upheaval. Imagine a new Sanguinius stepping onto the surface of Baal. The Blood Angels would lose their minds. Would they follow the new one as their lord, or fall into schism over whether he's real or not? Would the ecclesiarchy see him as a saint reborn, or a heretical impostor born of blasphemous science? Entire sectors could fall into civil war over the question of what he is, even before he lifts a weapon. And then there's the psychological weight. On Guilliman, on the Astartes, on everyone who still remembers what the Primarchs were. Guilliman has already expressed discomfort with how different he feels from the Imperium he returned to. Now imagine he has to stand next to a newly cloned brother. Someone who either doesn't recognize him or who looks at him and says, "You let this happen?" There's so much pain buried in the legacy of the Primarchs. So many betrayals, losses, and unresolved questions. A clone wouldn't just be a symbol of hope. He'd be a mirror held up to everything the Imperium has become. Strategically, of course, it would be a game changer. The Primarchs were forces of nature. Each one of them could change the course of a crusade or break the back of a rebellion. Even in a galaxy ruled by titans, demons, and star-eating horrors, a Primarch still matters. They lead not just with tactics, but with aura. People follow them not because they should, but because they must. So yeah, clone a few of them, and suddenly the balance of power across the stars shifts. Maybe the Imperium rallies, maybe it fractures. Either way, nothing stays the same. But let's not forget the darker possibilities. What if the clone isn't stable? We've seen what happens when beings of that scale aren't mentally or spiritually balanced. If a clone of Angron woke up and remembered just enough of his past to relive the trauma, but not enough to find purpose, it could be catastrophic. The same goes for someone like Perturabo or Mortarion. Even a loyalist clone could become unstable if the world they're reborn into doesn't make sense. And really, how could it? Everything they knew is gone. Their father is a silent husk. Their brothers are scattered, fallen, or dead. The ideals they fought for have been twisted beyond recognition. The warp complicates things even more. If you believe that the Primarchs were partially bound to the Immaterium, if their souls left a mark, then bringing them back could trigger all kinds of unintended consequences. Would a clone draw demonic attention? Would Tzeentch or Slaanesh try to claim them as vessels? Could their existence destabilize the already thin barrier between reality and the warp? Some fans think cloning a Primarch would be like lighting a psychic beacon, an irresistible signal to the predators of the galaxy. There's also the question of manipulation. A cloned Primarch would be vulnerable, uncertain, out of place, possibly even childlike in understanding. What's to stop a cunning faction from twisting them to their own ends? Imagine a clone of Lorgar raised secretly by a radical sect of the Ecclesiarchy, or a clone of Ferrus Manus taken in by a breakaway Forge world with no love for Terra. You're not just creating a hero, you're creating a potential weapon, one that may not even know it's being used. But even with all these risks, the idea is hard to shake, because deep down, we want to believe it could work. That maybe this time, it could be different. That a reborn Primarch might save more than he destroys. That the Imperium might find direction again. It's a dangerous hope, but it's hope, nonetheless. And in the world of 40K, that's more powerful than any bolter or battlecruiser. In the end, cloning a Primarch wouldn't just be a scientific breakthrough. It would be a philosophical rupture, a religious crisis, a political nightmare, and a battlefield shift all rolled into one. The galaxy would never be the same again. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes the idea so irresistible. Because in a universe built on stagnation and decline, the thought of a second chance, even a messy, unstable, controversial one, feels like revolution. Here's the part that really gives me chills when thinking about Primarch cloning. It's not just the Imperium that might be interested. Sure, they have the legacy, the genetic material, and the desperation. But in the vast madness of the galaxy, the Imperium is just one of many players. And if the idea of cloning the Emperor's sons has crossed our minds, you can bet it's crossed the minds of others. Some of them far less restrained, far more twisted, and maybe even more capable. Let's start with the obvious villain, Chaos. It's already part of the lore that Fabius Bile cloned Fulgrim. But what people don't always realize is that Bile's ambitions went much further. He didn't stop at Fulgrim. He wanted to clone all of the Primarchs, loyalist and traitor alike. And if anyone has the arrogance, the genius, and the utter lack of moral restraint to pull it off, it's him. Bile treats the genetic legacy of the Primarchs like a sandbox. He doesn't see it as sacred. He sees it as raw material, tools to be broken apart, reshaped, and perfected. There are rumors among fans that Bile may already have other cloned Primarchs hidden away, Early versions that failed, twisted hybrids, or even clones waiting to be unleashed. And if that's true, what happens if he decides to bring them out? Imagine a mockery of Rogel Dorn grown in a flesh vat, raised in the Eye of Terror, and taught to hate everything his original stood for. Or a corrupted clone of the Lion who turns the loyalty and nobility of the Dark Angels into something darker, something fanatic and cruel. Chaos doesn't need to recreate the Primarchs exactly. They just need to corrupt the idea of them. Use their images to inspire fear, break loyalties, and tear the Imperium apart from within. But chaos isn't the only threat. Let's talk about the Drukhari. I know it sounds outlandish, but hear me out. The Drukhari are masters of fleshcraft. Their homunculi can do things to biology that make even the Mechanicus look primitive. They've rebuilt warriors from scraps of meat, reanimated dead Eldari with new spines and memories, even created living nightmares from sheer imagination. If any race could physically clone a Primarch without understanding their spiritual significance, it's them. They probably wouldn't do it for conquest or ideology, but for entertainment, for art. Imagine a twisted showpiece Primarch on display in Kamara, forced to duel copies of himself night after night in some sadistic arena. It's grotesque, but horribly believable in the way only Warhammer can be. The Necrons are another wild card. On the surface, they don't deal with cloning or biology at all. They're soulless metal husks who scorn flesh. But that's only one layer of their empire. Some Necron dynasties still possess incredibly advanced biotechnological archives from before the biotransference. If any of them saw strategic value in studying the Primarchs, especially their warp-resistant traits, they might pursue cloning as a cold, calculated experiment. Not to worship, not to manipulate, but to dissect and control. Some fans theorize that the Necrons could attempt to create anti-chaos weapons by mimicking Primarch physiology. In their minds, they wouldn't be cloning gods, they'd be replicating blueprints. Even the Tau enter the conversation occasionally, though in a very different way. Their tech is advanced, but they lack psychers and access to the warp. That's always been their Achilles heel in the larger galactic game. But if the Tau ever got their hands on even a fragment of Primarch DNA, who's to say they wouldn't try to unlock its secrets? They'd probably see it not as divine, but as the pinnacle of Imperial bioengineering. Something to be understood, replicated, and maybe even integrated into their own caste system. A Tau-bred super soldier with Primarch traits might be their way of closing the gap, using the Imperium's ancient strengths against it. And what about the Genestealer cults? It sounds crazy, but some fans have gone down that rabbit hole. What if a cult embedded within the Mechanicus or the Inquisition managed to get access to gene seed or Primarch samples? What if they tainted them, hybridized them with Tyranid code? A Xenoprimarch, a biological blasphemy born from both humanity's greatest legacy and its most invasive predator. That's nightmare fuel. But again, this is Warhammer. Nightmare fuel is practically canon. There are also stranger ideas floating around. Things like rogue Astartes chapters who've broken away from the Imperium and gone dark, only to start experimenting with cloning in secret. Maybe some of them have recovered relics from the dark age of technology. Maybe they see themselves as heirs to the Primarchs and believe cloning is the only way to reclaim that legacy. There's something haunting about the idea of a lost chapter, holed up in some forgotten system, growing a new Ferrus Manus in a bunker, whispering stories of the Great Crusade into his ears. And we can't ignore the orcs, even if they're more of a long shot. Orcs aren't scientists in the traditional sense, but they have an uncanny ability to replicate complex machinery and biology based on instinct and collective memory. If they ever came across a Primarch's remains, could they try to grow one of their own just for the fun of the fight? Probably not a true clone, but maybe something close enough. Something massive, green, and full of misplaced divine rage. The point is, the Primarch's legacy is too big, too powerful to be left untouched. Every major faction in the galaxy has a reason, strategic, ideological, or purely chaotic, to want what the Primarchs represent. They're not just relics of the past, they're keys. Keys to power, to control, to fear. And the fact that cloning them is even theoretically possible means those keys are still out there, waiting to be seized. Whether for science, madness, revenge, or curiosity, The Primarchs are still being hunted. Not in the traditional sense, but in labs, in vaults, in whispered conversations behind sealed doors. And every time we think their story is over, someone else reaches into the past and tries to drag it screaming into the future. Maybe it's only a matter of time before someone succeeds. Maybe one day, we'll see a battlefield where not one, but many Primarchs return. Some born of loyalty, others born of spite, and none of them exactly what we hoped for. There's one more angle to all this that I just can't stop thinking about. Something that doesn't usually come up in the core lore discussions, but keeps getting whispered about in fan circles like an urban legend nobody wants to admit believing. What if the Primarchs were meant to be cloned all along? Not as a desperate reaction to a dying Imperium, but as part of the Emperor's original plan, one that was simply lost, buried, or intentionally hidden by time and tragedy. Some fans argue that the way the Primarchs were designed, their modular genetic structure, the way each one embodied an aspect of war, empire, or human nature, almost feels like they were never supposed to be singular. That maybe the Emperor didn't intend them to be unique, irreplaceable individuals, but prototypes. That the 20 we know were just the first 20. That somewhere in the data vaults of Terra, or the deeper chambers beneath Mars, there exists a blueprint for mass-producing leadership, demigods on command, not just to wage war, but to administrate, to govern, to inspire. This idea is wild, I know, but it plays into the mystery of the Lost Legions. Why were the 2nd and 11th purged so thoroughly? Some say it was because they failed. Others say they rebelled. But there's another theory, one I've always found both horrifying and oddly compelling, that the Emperor tried to clone those two specifically, that he ran them as long-term simulations for potential mass production of Primarch-grade generals, and that the result wasn't rebellion or corruption. It was a realization that you can't just replicate greatness, that making gods in a lab doesn't always yield gods. It might just yield monsters. There's something about that theory that makes the whole Imperium feel more tragic. Like even the Emperor, with all his arrogance and foresight, thought he could beat nature, beat chaos, beat the soul itself. And that's the thing, right? The soul. No matter how far we stretch gene science, no matter how perfectly we clone the body, the soul is still that unknown variable. You can't inject it, you can't program it. Maybe the reason clones always seem off, like Fulgrim's or Bile's attempts, is because there's something missing. Not just memory or identity, but that metaphysical spark that makes a Primarch. Not just a very angry giant with a sword. And yet the idea doesn't die, because the Imperium is a machine of desperation. It eats people, dreams, planets, and it's still starving. And in that starvation, any solution, no matter how dangerous, starts to look attractive. Cloning Primarchs might be forbidden, might be sacrilege, might even be doomed. But in the eyes of a dying species clinging to myths and half-remembered glories, it might also feel like the only option left. Some fans think this is exactly why the topic is so taboo in the setting. That it's not just heretical, it's tempting. Too tempting. That if the truth ever got out, that cloning could work, that the Emperor's work could be repeated, it wouldn't take long before someone tried. And once one clone walks the halls of Terra, it's over. The floodgates open. Every Forge world, every political faction, every dying chapter starts asking for their Primarch. And that's how you end up not with a reborn Imperium, but with 20 civil wars dressed in holy armor, each one screaming that their god has returned, and the others are lies. It's a terrifying idea. Not because it's impossible, but because it feels inevitable. Because in a galaxy that runs on legend, the line between myth and reality is always razor thin. And maybe that's what cloning the Primarchs really represents. Not science, not salvation, but temptation, the kind that unravels empires, the kind that whispers, you could bring them back, while quietly asking, and what would you do if they did? After digging through all of this, the science, the theology, the politics, the fan theories, I still find myself stuck on the same question I started with. Could the Primarchs be cloned? And the answer, maddeningly, seems to be yes, but also no. Yes, in the sense that the technology almost certainly exists, scattered and half understood in the vaults of the Mechanicus, whispered about by the likes of Belisarius Cawl, or desecrated and twisted by madmen like Fabius Bile. But also no, because cloning a Primarch isn't just about copying DNA. It's about trying to recreate a legend. And in a universe like Warhammer, where stories have power, that might be the one thing science can never fully replicate. What makes this whole topic so addictive to explore is how it touches on almost every tension in the setting. The grim future of humanity is defined by its fear of progress, its worship of the past, and its inability to let go of myths. And the Primarchs? They're the biggest myths of all. They were never meant to be just military commanders. They were the Emperor's vision of perfection, flawed, yes, sometimes tragically so, but still something larger than life. And trying to bring them back feels, in some strange way, like humanity admitting it never moved on. A cloned Primarch might look the part. He might even think the same thoughts, fight the same battles, lead with the same voice. But would he be the same? That's where fans start to divide. Some say yes, that what made the Primarchs great was their biology, their genetic blueprint. Others say no, that the soul, the experiences, the trauma, and even the chaos of their time are what truly made them who they were. And you can't grow that in a vat, no matter how advanced your technology is. But here's what really gets me. Even talking about cloning them feels like we're breaking a taboo, like we're walking through forbidden ground not meant to be disturbed. That's how deeply the Primarchs live in our collective imagination. They're not just characters, they're gods, demons, martyrs, betrayers, and saviors all rolled into one. They're the emotional foundation of the setting, and to try to replicate them, scientifically, clinically, almost feels like we're dismantling something sacred. And yet, we keep wondering, we keep asking, because the galaxy feels emptier without them. From a narrative perspective, the idea of cloned Primarchs opens some incredibly exciting and terrifying doors. It allows for questions we never thought we'd ask. What happens when a clone of Sanguinius is brought before the Emperor's throne? What happens if a new Horus rises, untainted, but full of the same charisma and strength? Could we do better this time? Could they? Or would the same fate unfold again, as if the universe itself rejects second chances? Some fans dream of redemption arcs, of long-lost brothers returning in new forms, struggling with fragmented memories and a world they no longer recognize. Others imagine darker paths, clones manipulated by shadowy forces, becoming pawns in the political games of the High Lords or the Inquisition. Maybe one clone unites a chapter, while another shatters an entire crusade. The potential is limitless, but so is the risk. And then there's the emotional weight. I think what draws so many of us to this idea isn't just the spectacle of it all. It's the hope. The thought that maybe, somehow, the tragedies of the past don't have to be permanent. That we can rebuild what was lost. That we can undo the long, slow rot that's been eating away at the Imperium for 10,000 years. It's a naive thought, sure, and probably dangerous. But in a universe where hope is a heresy, maybe heresy is exactly what we need. Of course, there's always the possibility that this is all just a distraction. That the real lesson of the Primarchs isn't in trying to bring them back, but in learning from what they left behind. Their failures, their victories, their deeply human flaws. Maybe the point isn't to clone them at all, but to understand why we want to. Because that desire says something about the state of the galaxy. It says, we're still looking for heroes, still hoping that someone stronger, wiser, more perfect will come and fix the mess we're in. But that's not how the Imperium works. That's not how Warhammer works. In the end, the galaxy doesn't give us saviors. It gives us broken men, scarred warriors, and impossible choices. And maybe that's why the Primarchs were so compelling in the first place. Not because they were flawless, but because they weren't. Because even gods, in the end, bleed like everyone else. So, could the Primarchs be cloned? Yeah, probably. Has the Imperium already tried? Almost certainly. But should they be cloned? That's the real question. And the answer to that might say more about us than it does about the setting. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most fascinating what-ifs in 40K lore, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment sharing your favorite theory, or which Primarch you'd clone and why. We've got plenty more grimdark mysteries to unravel, and I'd love to hear what you think. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war and occasionally a little genetic heresy.